Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to another episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We're your hosts, Jennifer Parker and Richard Dunley. The Maritime Matters podcast is a podcast where we discuss the key developments and activities that have been affecting maritime security in Australia and the Indo-Pacific region over the past couple of weeks. We're recording this on Thursday, the 17th of April, so just before Easter. As ever, the caveats, if something crazy happens over the next few days before we manage to get this out, that's why we're not talking about it. And in the world in which we live, that seems like not an implausible kind of thing to say. Anyway, with that rather rambling introduction, how are you, Jen?
I am good. I think there's lots happening. So for those that aren't Australian who are listening to this, we are in the midst of an Australian election campaign, which we mentioned in our last episode. So Australia will go to the polls on the 3rd of May, coincidentally at the same day as Singapore going to the polls, which is interesting.
I did not know that. That is interesting.
It is interesting. But the reason I mention that is certainly driving a lot of the dynamics around the defence and national security conversation in Australia, which did, I guess, pour out into the maritime domain, for want of a cooler analogy. And we talked about that last episode in terms of the Chinese spy ship saga, of which I've got to give a little bit of a plug. I've got a piece in Lowy's Interpreter today that we'll put a link in the show notes talking about the Chinese spy ship saga. And this is the vessel that was driving around Australia and has now positioned itself about 900 nautical miles to the west of Perth in the Indian Ocean, conducting exploration of a trench. And so it talks about how the political dynamics kind of influence that. And if you actually just look at the vessel's track, course and speed, you can make some assessments about what it was and was not doing. So that piece is out there, and it kind of buttresses on to our election. There's been lots of conversation in Australia about Indonesia and Russia. We won't get into that here because that is not truly a maritime discussion. But what have you been up to, Richard? You've been all over the place.
Yeah, so I've been kind of head down over the past couple of weeks. A little while ago, a group of us here at UNSW Canberra ran a public opinion poll survey on Australian attitudes towards the ADF as an institution and kind of the roles it does and the things it does. And obviously, since the election being called, we've desperately needed to get something out there. So I've been working on that, and hopefully I'll have a piece out next week in the conversation, talking about some of the findings of that in the relation to the election, and in relation to the debates going on inside the sort of the election about whether or not there needs to be additional funding for the ADF. So that's been quite interesting, trying to explore that. And as we're doing plugs, there's a podcast out in the RUSI podcast series that I recorded actually at the end of last year, that is now out, in which I talked to them about Admiral Sir John Fisher, a very famous leader of the Royal Navy, first Sea Lord in the early 20th century. And I talk about his kind of reforming attitude and both the positives and negatives that go along with that. So they're talking about strategic leaders, and so we explore some of those. So if you're interested in kind of the historical side, maybe take a listen to that.
It is definitely added to the things to do over the Easter long weekend, which is unfortunately is a long list of things that are not going to get done. But that's fantastic. Well, I look forward to listening to that. Now, a lot's been happening in the region. So somebody pointed out to me yesterday that we do profess that this is a weekly podcast, except it is not. It's a when we have time podcast. So we haven't done this in about 2.5 weeks or so, and there has been a lot happening in the capability space, especially in the uncrewed capability space, which we'll get into. Some stuff around AUKUS. Of course, you can't have a discussion around maritime in Australia without talking about AUKUS, or as the Sydney Morning Herald referred to it today as the fourth service of the ADF. I wouldn't go that far. But lots happening there, but also lots happening in the region in terms of Philippines, China, There's a carrier strike group on its way from the UK. And of course, HMAS Sydney, Australia's air warfare destroyer, is deployed into the region. So why don't we get into it, Richard, with what's been happening?
Absolutely, Jen. Lots going on in the region. Why don't we start off by talking a little bit about the report that was released a week or so ago into the loss of HMNZS Manawanui, the New Zealand vessel that sank late last year.
So the HMNZS Manawanui sunk on the 5th of October last year in the vicinity of Samoa, and it's conducting some hydrographic surveys around that. Was one of New Zealand's 9 vessels, many of which were not operational at the time, but now they have about 8. And so the sinking has been pretty significant for New Zealand for a number of ways, not just the loss of capability, also the first sinking of a vessel for New Zealand since World War II, etc., etc. And it really has kind of stirred up a lot of conversation about the current capability of the New Zealand Navy. And that links a lot to investment. And we'll get into this when we talk about New Zealand defence spending. The Court of Inquiry has been pretty damning in its conclusions, and really it says that the grounding came down to a series of human errors. In the end, and I'm paraphrasing dramatically, please go to the report, but it talks about the fact that the autopilot was on, and at no point during the time on the bridge when they were trying to fault find what had happened did anyone switch it off. And that really comes down to training. Now, when they've broken it down, though, they've said that there were a number of factors that led to this, right? It's not just this one example, because you can go, oh, that's really simple. We just train people differently. There's a number of factors that get to this point. It talks about issues in terms of training experience. It talks about the military hydrographic planning and how the planning and certainly the risk assessments weren't done correctly. It talks about issues with orders, instructions and procedures, the operational risk matrix, force generation, operational release of ships, supervision, violations, haste, leadership, distraction, interruptions, and hollowness. There is a whole bunch of that to wrap into it. So it's not just about not realizing that the autopilot was still on. It provides a series of recommendations. It talks about recommendations with respect to risk management, orders and instructions, force generation, life-saving equipment, training experiences, hollowness, etc. And I think that really, in many of those issues, it kind of is probably a bit of a wake-up call for New Zealand. And New Zealand has a lot of challenges in terms of its investment in capability and the size of its navy and workforce. And when you think about training, when you have, New Zealand doesn't have a lot of ships, but all of its ships are pretty much of different classes, which requires different training pipelines for people. When you have a small navy and you have that increased training burden, you have a lot of challenges. And so, look, I won't go too much else into the report because we have a lot to cover today, but I think the report's about 120 pages. I think it certainly needs to be acknowledged that it looks like the New Zealand Navy has tried very hard to be very transparent in what has happened here, which I think certainly deserves a lot of kudos. The report, given the sinking was on the 5th of October, has actually come out quite quickly. Now, I won't go into Australian challenges, but there have been a number of Australian incidents over the last 20 years where the reports have taken many years to get released, and certainly not released to this degree of transparency. So I think the New Zealand Navy deserves a pat on the back. But I think also there's going to be a lot of soul searching now in New Zealand Navy in terms of how do we address these issues. Yes, funding is an aspect. Training is a clear aspect. The size of the New Zealand Navy is a clear aspect. What's your take on the final findings and the assessment that it was very much human error with a number of contributing factors into the sinking of Manawanui?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of known the specific elements for a little while now, and I think there was not shock, but I guess surprise when that was first sort of coming out, the degree to which this seems to have been an issue of human error. But I think it's the broader cultural service-wide issues that I think is actually the interesting part here. And as you've sort of already mentioned, that the challenges that come from trying to operate a small navy in increasingly kind of technologically advanced times when you're having to try and maintain capability, training, and skills across a wide variety of areas, across multiple ship classes. It's extremely difficult, and it is something I think that, yes, this is obviously a New Zealand issue, but it is something I think that is a wider small to medium-sized Navy issue as well. And we'll come on in a second to talk about kind of New Zealand defence funding and perhaps where that direction is going. But I do kind of wonder whether there's also scope here for greater integration or links with allies. The obvious one would be Australia, just in terms of the fact that New Zealand is always going to struggle to have a kind of sufficient critical mass to be able to operate a navy, and that's been a problem that goes way back, certainly into the sort of 1970s and 1980s. You look at the discussions around them acquiring the Anzac frigates, and there were even then questions about basically whether New Zealand was big enough to have what might be described as a real navy rather than a kind of more Coast Guard focused force. So that question about how New Zealand squares that circle of whether or not it is quite big enough to sustain a viable force, I think is something that is worth keeping an eye on. And I think there may well be some more kind of trans-Tasman questions and connections coming through there.
No, I completely agree with you, and I think that there is a point that, in terms of Australia's fleet construction, the path we've gone down now with the 3 AWDs, 6 Hunters, a handful of Arafura offshore patrol vessels, and then 11 general purpose frigates. The challenge that comes when you do something like that in terms of your fleet design is the training burden that will create. Not to mention the sustainment burdens, but the training burden that will create. And I think that that will be a significant challenge for Australia in the medium term. And I agree. I think in New Zealand, I haven't read their new defence capability plan that'll come out, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit more in a second. It's on the list. But in terms of their strategic thinking, and we are seeing some of this messaging from their PM, Christopher Luxon, there does need to be a lot more alignment with Australia, I think, in terms of capability acquisition and training pipelines to really pull themselves out of this. And I think that might be a challenge in New Zealand from a political perspective because there are differences, less so under the current New Zealand government, but from a practical perspective. And I think, one of the crazy decisions, I think, from the previous New Zealand government was the decision to upgrade the Anzac class frigates in Canada and lose a significant degree of commonality with the Australian Anzac class frigates. And so, I guess we will see what their strategy is, but I think some more alignment will benefit them. Now, on defence spending, you mentioned defence spending for New Zealand. So what's happened with defence spending for New Zealand?
So there's been some big announcements and big kind of bold statements coming from both Luxon and the Defence Minister, Judith Collins, who's made some quite kind of catchy sort of sound bites, I guess. Things like the fact that she intends to take the New Zealand Defence Force out of the intensive care unit, and saying about how basically you can't cope with or rectify issues from decades of underinvestment without spending some serious money. So what they're talking about doing is expanding military spending from the moment it's roughly around 1% of GDP, certainly in 2024, that's kind of the figure. Within 8 years, they're talking about getting past 2% of GDP. So effectively doubling it in real terms in the space of under a decade. So that's a considerable amount of money. Now, we've not seen huge amounts of detail, I think, on precisely where a lot of that money is going to. Certainly not in the kind of the maritime vein. There have been some specific mentions focused in sort of land and air, but I think we are going to see more money. They're talking about kind of $9 billion of new spending, etc. So I think the interesting questions then come certainly from a maritime perspective of where do they go with that, and whether or not there are questions asked once again about things like there was a lot of discussion when the C-3000 general purpose frigate was first the project was first raised and discussed in Australia about whether or not this could be a new Anzac class, another kind of trans-Tasman project. And it seemed quite clear at the time that there wasn't any interest from the New Zealand government. Whether or not that changes, I think, will be worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, look, you're right about kind of limited detail. I actually think that so long as the general purpose frigate is an affordable solution, I think New Zealand will jump on board. I think they have limited options there. I understand some of the money, the increased money, the Defence Capability Plan is to upgrade their frigates, but there's only so much you can do with an ageing Anzac hull, as Australia has learned. So they're going to have to announce a replacement. I think the fact that they didn't announce a replacement, I think it indicates they're holding off on the Australian general purpose frigate. I had heard previously that the reason they didn't jump on board the Hunter is the Hunter was just too expensive for New Zealand. So general purpose frigate is probably an option. I'm not going to put money on it, but potentially. I also saw some reporting that some of the money talked about a new fleet of maritime helicopters. To operate from its current naval vessels, which I think is certainly important for New Zealand. And there was some conversation around increased maritime strike capabilities. Now, what that actually means, who knows? New Zealand has very limited capabilities in that space. I suspect there's, some sort of conversation around the acquisition of naval strike missile, which would make sense for New Zealand, certainly. And potentially some land-based capability, but all to be seen at the moment. What else is happening in the region, Richard?
So Operation Argos, and I have to get this right, Argos, not Argus, every time. This is the operation under which Australia provides forces to support the UN Security Council resolution-based sanctions on North Korea. And earlier this month, a Australian P-8 Maritime Patrol aircraft was deployed to Japan and is operating out of Kadena Air Base in Japan and is going to conduct a number of surveillance missions and generally kind of supporting this international mission, which is enforcing sanctions on North Korea as part of kind of wider efforts to get North Korea to denuclearize and kind of align with the UN Security Council resolutions. So that's an important deployment. We've seen a number of deployments now of Australian forces into this mission since 2018, deploying maritime patrol aircrafts on 15 occasions, and RAN vessels have supported the mission on 12 separate occasions. So this is part of a regular rotation of Australian forces to support this mission.
Yeah, it's certainly a mission that I know it's been going since 2018, but it does feel like, I know feeling is not good analysis, but it does feel like that there has been much more of a focus on it in the last couple of years, which is interesting. Last year, the oversight body that oversees these sanctions in the UN Security Council did not renew it. So this is a really an interesting program of the UN Security Council. But either way, Australia certainly sees it as a focus. And we've got to remember too that HMAS Hobart, when their helicopter was intercepted unsafely by a Chinese fighter aircraft last year with flares deployed in front of it, was actually conducting this. And HMAS Toowoomba, that was, operating in the Japanese exclusive economic zone in November 23, when it was approached by a Chinese destroyer unsafely. It was stopped in the water conducting diving operations, clearing a net that had found its props. And the Chinese destroyer did actually radiate the divers in the water with sonar. It had just been doing Argos as well. So I think this is a really interesting one in terms of where it fits in Australia's thinking and the broader where this operation is going, especially with issues with the UN Security Council oversight. Certainly there is some sensitivity in the PLA about this operation. I think you can assume that based on those two issues. Now, something exciting that's going to be happening in the Indo-Pacific. We've seen a number of carrier deployments to the Indo-Pacific of late. So we've seen a French carrier down here last year. We saw an Italian carrier down here, which actually participated in Exercise Pitch Black, which I think is probably the first ever ship to participate in Exercise Pitch Black, which is a Royal Australian Air Force multinational exercise that occurs every 2 years. But we have another carrier on its way. So what carrier is heading down here?
So HMS Prince of Wales. This is one of the UK's two large Queen Elizabeth class carriers. So obviously, and in sort of, I guess, not quite kicking off, but I guess the first of these really significant carrier deployments to European carrier deployments to the Indo-Pacific was the deployment of Queen Elizabeth in 2021 within this kind of Indo-Pacific narrative, at least. And since then, we've seen French and Italians also doing similar sorts of major deployments. Well, the Brits are back at it again. So HMS Prince of Wales is soon to leave the UK, and she is going to do a long deployment through the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean, and then out into East Asia as part of what is known as Operation High Mast. This is a significant Royal Navy operation. Obviously, it's also a significant Royal Air Force operation because the F-35s are operated by the Royal Air Force, and also includes Army personnel. So big deployment, high-profile deployment, which involves not merely UK assets, but a lot of other nations being involved at various stages. So there's considerable support from Norway. So Norway's providing a frigate throughout and a resupply vessel for parts of the operation. The Canadians are also providing a frigate, and I'm not sure whether it's going to go through for all of the operation, but at least a significant part of it. And there is then sort of other contributions from nations, including Spain, and I think there's sort of collaboration with other places on the way. So I think their carrier strike routes can be operated with the Italians in the Mediterranean, and then conducting exercises with the Japanese out in East Asia, and will be taking part in Operation Talisman Sabre here in Australia. So really big, high-profile kind of deployment. Interesting framing, and I saw somebody we both know quite well, Alessio Padalano, talking about this on Twitter, how the framing of this has slightly shifted away from it being kind of real Indo-Pacific focused and towards more focusing on kind of alliances and partners. And I'm not sure. It's always difficult to kind of read the tea leaves on this, but it is very clear how this is being used to kind of flag UK relationships, both European relationships in kind of European waters, so operations in the Mediterranean, etc., and connections with Norway, which is becoming a really quite important UK maritime connection, becoming again, but also things like Japan, seen now as an increasingly important UK partner with things like the GCAP fighter. So there's some quite interesting narratives and things at play there. And I guess obviously Australia. We can't forget Australia and AUKUS. So yeah, really interesting and important deployment, and we'll hear a lot more about the activities of HMS Prince of Wales and the kind of multinational task force over the next few months.
Yeah, I think they said 12 countries or something participating. I don't know, but I would be surprised if there is not an Australian ship that joins for part of that deployment. I think there was last time in 2021. Interesting, if you are interested in the last deployment of a UK carrier to the region, I did do a podcast in 2023 on the Australian Naval Institute Saltwater Strategist, interviewing the commander of that deployment, Rear Admiral Steve Morehouse, who was also my previous commanding officer many years ago when we were both much younger. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. It talks about what the UK was trying to achieve in 2021. And I think a lot of that is still very relevant now. It is interesting, I think, the Norway deployment. I'm not sure if there were Norwegian ships associated with the carrier deployment in 2021. I feel like there wasn't, but I'd have to go back and check my facts. But Norway continues to be a country that I think punches above its weight in terms of maritime capability. Whether we talk about the naval strike missile and Kongsberg, or some of its recent acquisitions, certainly there's a lot of lessons Australia could learn, I think, from how Norway does business. But yes, interesting deployment. Interesting too, I think. I feel like this is the first non-US carrier to participate in Talisman Sabre. I'm fairly confident of that statement, which is interesting itself. And I think, Talisman Sabre, we'll obviously talk a lot about that as it comes up later in the year. But Talisman Sabre has a really interesting journey in itself. In Australia, originally an Australia-US bilateral exercise with, participation from New Zealand, sometimes depending on how the US-New Zealand relationship was at the time. But, in the last kind of, maybe since 2017, I'd have to check my dates, it has really become a multinational exercise, which is fascinating. And it's fascinating because Talisman Sabre was very much previously about interoperability between the US and Australia. And if you want to focus on interoperability, then you need to do things at a high level of classification, often which precludes other countries participating. But now it has dramatically expanded. I think last time it was conducted 2023, I feel like there was about 14 different countries or in the order of magnitude that participated. So it's interesting the direction that's going in, and now the participation of a UK carrier strike group. So that's fascinating. And I think that the key point that I'd say from that is it's gone from an exercise focused on interoperability between 2 and sometimes 3 countries to an exercise that's very much focused on a regional demonstration, in my view. And this carrier strike group from the UK really backs that up.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think the signalling is clearly there, and I think it's pretty clearly picked up most of the time. And I suspect we will see vessels coming to observe what is going on, and I suspect we will see that the UK carrier strike group carefully monitored through much of its activity in this region. So I think, there is signalling from all sides going on here, but that's part of what navies do, right?
Very, very true. Now, speaking of other navies, so USS Blue Ridge is in Cairns, so a US 7th Fleet command platform, obviously down from Japan. I don't know. I suspect this has something probably to do with Talisman Sabre planning. But either way, interesting visit, and it really kind of coincides with the increased US focus on Australia. We are seeing more US port visits, whether that be ship port visits, whether it be Coast Guard port visits, or whether that be submarine port visits, with USS Minnesota recently in WA, and also in Darwin, which I don't think we spoke about because it fell... it was an off week for this podcast, but that was interesting in itself. USS Minnesota, being a nuclear-powered US submarine, coming into the port of Darwin with its tender, the US MRES Land. Speaking of other ship movements, look, we should flag, I think we talked about this a little while ago, but HMAS Sydney, one of Australia's air warfare destroyers, is on its regional presence deployment, which is a pretty common thing for Australian ships now. They seem to be roughly about 3 months long, 6 weeks to 3 months long. And it's been up in Southeast Asia conducting exercise Basama Shield, which is an exercise conducted under the Five Power Defence Agreement every 2 years. So Five Power Defence Agreement or arrangement, which includes Malaysia, Singapore, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. What else is happening in the region? There's some stuff about uncrewed underwater vehicles, Richard. What is happening with uncrewed underwater vehicles?
So this was a little snippet of a story which came up, and I think it was more about what's been said about them than anything else. So I don't think it will come as a surprise to many people who kind of vaguely follow this area that a number of uncrewed underwater vehicles of varying different types have been recovered from various parts or around the Philippines and the waters around the Philippines over the past couple of years. Whether that's things that have washed up on shore, or I think a lot of the time this is stuff which gets caught up in fishing and other kind of peaceful maritime activities. And there were just some statements that were made by the Philippines Navy about these, basically saying that a number of these have been recovered from different parts of the Philippines over the past couple of years, and that analysis that's been done in the Philippines confirms that at least some, if not all, of these have come from China. Now, we're not talking here about kind of super large, flashy, exciting sort of things that like Ghost Shark or Orca or that kind of idea of uncrewed underwater vehicles. What we are far more thinking about here are kind of gliders, things that are out in the environment, which are basically soaking up lots and lots of data. At times they might be doing some kind of sort of surveying or that sort of thing, but they are basically trying to collect information about the maritime environment, and this can be extremely useful, particularly for things like submarine operations and ASW operations. So I don't think this comes as any surprise. There have been a number of other incidents like this. There was one in Indonesia a couple of years ago where Indonesian fishermen pulled out a Chinese UUV. So not hugely surprising, but interesting that it is happening. And I guess it's also quite interesting, kind of the scale. How many of these things are there if a number of them have washed up on shore in the Philippines in the past couple of years? So, yeah.
Definitely. And I think when these things are always made public, I think it's always interesting to think about why they're being made public now.
Yes.
So, you know, the article that talks about it refers to, in the statement from Rear Admiral Roy Vincent Trinidad, who's the Navy's spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea, talks about this occurring between 2022 and 2024. I'm sure it is still probably occurring. But it has been released this week. And I think that's interesting, interesting timing with Xi Jinping traveling through Southeast Asia. And I think in Malaysia today, I'd have to check my dates, but I think there's some messaging about from the Philippines to other Southeast Asian countries about things that China has been doing in the maritime domain. So I think the timing of the release of this is intentional to coincide with that visit, which is interesting in itself.
Absolutely. Moving on, because we have to keep moving on. Capability.
Lots happening in capability. A lot of things in the uncrewed space. A lot of developments. Richard, I saw you had a tweet out recently about Anduril.
Yes.
What's Anduril been doing in the uncrewed space?
Well, Anduril has been releasing lots of press releases, which is interesting, and we'll come on to why I framed it like that in a second. But they've basically released press releases about two significant new capabilities, both of which fit into this kind of uncrewed underwater vehicle space broadly. The first is around what they call Seabed Century, which is a underwater kind of sensor and effectively a network, potential network of underwater sensors, which can be connected up. These are underwater sensors are by no means new. The kind of the most famous is the Cold War SOSUS system, which the Americans used to monitor Soviet submarines from the 1960s and 70s onwards. So this is not a radically new idea. I think everyone, it's highly secretive area, but everyone kind of expects that all sides, all great powers are involved in doing this kind of thing at the moment. But Anduril are effectively doing what they do, which is saying, actually, new technology allows us to do this smaller, cheaper, more effectively, and on a much bigger scale. And that is the kind of pitch with this. And they are saying that these could be deployed by their UUVs. So they've got what's known as the dive family, of which Ghost Shark is derived. So Ghost Shark is an Anduril development. And these can be used for a range of different things, including supporting the protection of maritime infrastructure, but also for monitoring, basically monitoring what's going on in the underwater environment. So that's one set. And the other one, which I found more intriguing, is the idea of what they're describing as Copperhead, which is their new torpedo. This is a range of what they're describing as torpedoes to be deployed from uncrewed platforms. But then they have a whole host of rather confusing missions associated with these, including search and rescue and critical infrastructure inspection. I'm not entirely sure how that aligns with certainly what I would traditionally imagine to be a torpedo, but I think they're kind of playing a lot of sides here. But I think there's some really interesting kind of questions about kind of the deployment of munitions from uncrewed platforms. And I know you and I have talked at length at various stages about legality, ethics, and all sorts of other things of doing that. And there's a whole host of questions there. But Anduril are clearly trying to push the envelope with this. And I'll come back to my initial statement, which is that I am a little skeptical about some of these sorts of things. Anduril are very, very good at selling what they do. And I think it'll be interesting to see as and when rubber starts to hit the road or kit starts to hit the water, to see sort of the way in which some of this plays out. Certainly the narrative they were talking about around torpedoes in terms of kind of this replacing legacy kit, I'm going to sort of say I have I'm going to retain a healthy skepticism on that front.
Yeah, look, I thought with respect to the seabed sentry, I thought it was interesting that there was a press release and this was made public. I mean, all sorts of countries invest in all sorts of underwater detection capability. It's actually very rarely spoken about. And I think that's probably why there's such limited knowledge, I think, in the general public about undersea warfare and seabed warfare and what that actually entails, which I think it a little bit kind of brought itself out in the debate about the Chinese spy ship, not to go back to that point. But I think limited understanding of how these things kind of work, because it's very rare that this stuff is spoken about in public. In fact, I can't remember what year the SOSUS arrays, the US SOSUS arrays, which is actually now called IUSS. I can't remember what that stands for. Sorry for the person that keeps telling us to spell out acronyms. You're right, but I can't remember what it stands for. It took a long time for that to actually be available in the public domain. So interesting that this is a press release. Look, it certainly is a huge industry in protection of underwater maritime critical infrastructure, whether that be looking at port protection, whether that look at me at subsea cables, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly Anduril see a way of getting into this, and it fits with their wider philosophy of trying to find quicker ways to build things at scale and much cheaper. In terms of the performance metrics of these capabilities, etc., who knows? I know that Alex Luck had some commentary. Alex Luck from Naval News had some commentary. I think it was on a Twitter feed. It might be an article as well about the Copperhead M and the amount of explosives that it could actually carry compared to something like a Mark 48, right? And when you are thinking about torpedoes and impact underwater, because of the way they actually work, so a torpedo it's not designed to explode when it hits the ship. It's designed to explode underneath the ship. It requires a significant amount of explosive power to do that, to effectively break the back of the ship. And so when you look at the amount of explosives these things can carry, there is a question about how they might be employed or how effective they are. That said, look, I think these are all interesting developments, and potentially they are a wait and see. Speaking of underwater, we have not spoken about AUKUS. Well, we spoke about it at the start, but we haven't spoken about AUKUS, at least since our last podcast, which is 2 weeks ago.
That's a record for you, Jen, isn't it?
It is. Well, actually, I did say last year I was never going to speak about AUKUS again. I lie. We haven't spoken about it. We had a telephone conversation yesterday where we did speak about a piece I'm writing on AUKUS. So we have spoken about it, but Hey, what's happened? What's happened with AUKUS? Has it
So
fallen apart?
it's not fallen apart yet.
Oh, really? If you read the
despite
press, you think it has every week. Yeah.
despite the press calls again. I think it was in the Sydney Morning Herald. There was an editorial earlier this week calling for an inquiry into AUKUS, and there has been. I think it's not yet getting any traction politically. It very clearly didn't get any traction politically in the leaders' debate last night. But I think that there is pressure in Australia around that, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out after the election. In the UK, you've seen a inquiry launched from the Parliamentary Defence Select Committee, which is again exploring the AUKUS partnership and basically what they're talking about, the impact of geopolitical shifts. I don't think it takes too much to read between the lines to work out what they might be talking about there. At the same time, I think you've seen the Prime Minister in the UK, Keir Starmer, appoint Sir Stephen Lovegrove, who has been filled a number of different kind of senior positions in the UK kind of national security apparatus, and he has now been appointed. And I have to get my statement right. Oh, he's the special representative, the Prime Minister's special representative on AUKUS. And this has been framed as how Britain can maximise the benefits of AUKUS and unlock more opportunities. So I think there's been quite a lot of discussion in Australia sort of suggesting that Britain is pulling back and is sort of concerned. And I think there's some suggestion that is true in places. And well, I think it's clear it is true in certain areas. But in terms of the response of the British government, it is very much continuing to see AUKUS as an opportunity, and the appointment of Lovegrove, I think, highlights that, and I'm sure the idea at least is to give kind of greater strategic direction to Britain's engagement with AUKUS. So we'll see how this plays out. I think you're seeing sort of trends in both directions a little bit there.
Yeah, and look, I think the review, the UK Defence Committee's review, certainly got a lot of play here in Australia. And I think it is prudent to be doing reviews of these projects from time to time. And I don't actually think that there's any issues right now with the Australian AUKUS. Sorry, let me clarify. Any major issues with the Australian AUKUS project? Of course, there's going to be issues, but I wouldn't be opposed to a 4-year mark review either. I think that these things do need to be constantly monitored. But I think it's important that most of the messaging from the UK Parliament around this review is that it's not about is AUKUS the right decision. It's about are we optimising and getting the most out of it that we can, which I think are two very different questions. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see where that comes out. I think the report is due by October this year, so around the 4-year anniversary of AUKUS, and I think that will be keenly read in Australia as well.
Yeah, it's also worth keeping in mind that select committees, they're not quite the same as a Senate Estimates Committee here in Australia, but they do have their own political drivers and forces that shape them, and that they can often be, whether they be kind of party political or driven by other kind of factors. So I think at times, in the same way that at times in the Australian discussion, things like the Congressional Research Service has been somewhat misrepresented, I think you can perhaps draw the wrong conclusions from, like, select committees do really good work and produce really interesting reports, but they're not necessarily the view of government, even where there are perhaps government backbenchers involved. So I think, as ever, understanding context is important here.
And I think, when we talk about, it's not quite the equivalent committee, but when we talk about these things, I always think about the 2004 Joint Standing Committee into Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, or as it was named then, in Australia, that did inquiry into Australia's maritime strategy, which is always a good reference and it's always a good read. And if you're interested in maritime strategic thinking in Australia, leading up from Federation through to 2004, going through this is actually a good way to get an overview of it. But the reason I highlight it is I can't remember exactly how many recommendations are. There was a significant number of recommendations that came out of that. And when I looked at this last year for its 20th anniversary in June last year, what was clear was almost none of those recommendations were enacted. So it certainly was not representative of the government's view at the time. Interestingly, and I'm going tangential here, but one of the first recommendations in it was that Australia establish a national security strategy, which we have not done. But anyway, on the topic of uncrewed capabilities, which we talked about a little bit, I think we just need to give a bit of a shout out to OCIS, which is an Australian-owned company that produces the Blue Bottle. The Blue Bottle, I think, is about 7 meters long. It's a solar-powered, wave-powered, uncrewed surface vessel. You can attach a whole heap of different capabilities to that. I think that there's been trials of it with towed array systems, and it certainly has electro-optical and infrared capabilities. The reason I'm giving them a shout out is that New Zealand has just, after a 7-month trial, the New Zealand Defence Force and the New Zealand Customs Service have acquired 2 of these. Now, 2 is not much, and these things are designed to be operated at scale, so 2 is not going to do a whole bunch for you. But it does show New Zealand getting into the uncrewed surface vessel game, and it's good to see an Australian company being the company they selected for that. And I would suspect that 2 will roll out to be more in future.
Absolutely. They're good bits of kit, and as you say, it's good to see that this business going to an Australian company.
And then finally, I guess on the uncrewed capability, look, I think interesting. So when we talk about the use of uncrewed capabilities in the maritime domain, we're talking about a large spectrum of capabilities, right? And I think that some of the mission sets that people put forward for them, I think, are a little bit fanciful. So the idea of a UUV in the near term replacing a crewed submarine, for example. But there are some mission sets that seem absolutely designed for uncrewed capabilities. And I think in some ways, in my view, mine warfare is a key example of that, as is, I've got to be honest, I think kind of logistics and that ship-to-shore connector in amphibious operations. But I've not seen too much on that point. But on the mine warfare, there are a lot of companies that are trying to get into this game with uncrewed capabilities. The UK, the Royal Navy has recently launched an uncrewed surface vessel that is a mine warfare capability. And we saw on the 4th of April that the US, so Bollinger Shipyards in the US, has delivered the first of 3 autonomous. They've said autonomous. Now, in this conversation about uncrewed capabilities, often autonomous is used to replace the term remote control, 2 different things. But anyway, an autonomous mine countermeasures uncrewed surface vehicle for the US Navy. And they're saying that it will have the ability to conduct mine sweeping, mine hunting, 2 different things, and mine neutralization. Now, mine neutralization is often done in most modern navies now by AUVs anyway, so autonomous underwater vehicles. But this seems to be a step change in capability. I flag it here because there's been a big debate in Australia about our future mine warfare capability and the lack of a clear direction. So I think this is an interesting capability. I note the US, though, only seem to have ordered 3 at this stage.
Yep, it's MCM has been the kind of the flag bearer and the go-to for uncrewed capability in the maritime space for a long time. I'm still a little bit skeptical, if only because this capability has been coming for at least as long as I've been following this kind of business, which is sadly too long now. And it's always been a year away, and it keeps on being a year away. So we'll see whether or not this is really fully operational. But certainly, yeah, the Royal Navy has been talking a lot about this in the past few months, as have, and the French are very keen on it, the Americans now. But for example, a autonomous-based MCM package was supposed to be a key part of the littoral combat ship, for a very long time, and I think we're still. It still seems unclear as to whether or not that capability is really yet fully there. So I think it's definitely a great capability and a great role for uncrewed platforms. Let's see whether or not it is fully there.
No, I think your skepticism is definitely well placed. But look, Richard, I think we have gone well over time, which we'll say every episode, but we don't become more disciplined. So I think we probably need to wrap it up there. Obviously, there are a lot of developments in maritime and Indo-Pacific that we haven't covered in this brief podcast, but hopefully it's given you a short taster of what's happening in the region at the moment.
As ever, good to chat, Jen. And remember, everyone, maritime matters.
Thanks so much, Richard.
Cheers.